regarding the risk assessment. You can interrupt any one of us in town. You don't have to hold any questions to the end. John's been doing this longer than me. He was in doing a risk, when it was called risk-based assessment a while back when I was in another group. Last year when we got restructured and assigned as the operation planning analyst for inherent risk assessment. So we both use the same approach. It's the same approach to regions. We were at the IRA workshop a couple weeks ago, and each region was presenting what their approach was. And I think we were the fourth region to present. And by that time, I was already bored hearing about everybody's approach because we all pretty much followed that IRA guide, as Jeff and Tony talked about yesterday. You know, some of the tools are different. Each entity created tools specific to help them develop the inherent risk. We all collect the information in some fashion, whether it's sending profiles out or questionnaires or a tool they have that you submit the data to them. It's all pretty much done the same, especially maybe the regions that are multi-regional. May see some differences there, but from a reliability first standpoint, we're pretty much following everybody else is doing. We'll maybe talk about some of the differences there.
Good on still. Make sure that the button on the side is on. Just you need to answer. Hold on a minute.
That was working earlier.
It's not working now.
One thing I want to talk about before we work on the slides here, a couple of comments yesterday I've heard, and I heard this from regions too. This is something we try to avoid doing or saying.
Answer, John.
And your entities, if you're a large entity, just because somebody's a large entity doesn't mean you're high risk. Because we can have that mentality. If someone's a large entity, you're high risk. If you're a small entity, you're small risk. And we might as well just put everybody in those three buckets and be done with it. It'll save a lot of headache. We don't look at it that way. We just look at the entity. We look at the functions. We use the IRA Appendix C, which we're going to talk about. We'll look at your compliance history, all the data and documentation we have, besides what you validate, and then we come up with the risk is. It may fall in that category, it may not, but we don't have any preconceived notion about, because you're so have being a high risk, you know, we're going to go through all the process and see how it ends up. Make sure we clear that up first. We're going to try to give you an understanding of what our process is. Tony and Jeff Craig yesterday talked about overall what the process was, and we'll get into a little bit more detail. Some of you, maybe you've already experienced some of our questionnaires, send the information out, and been on the receiving end of what our scope adjustments were. But we'll talk about more exactly what John and I are doing regarding office planning or SIP. There's three areas we're going to talk about. There's other tools we use that are part of your inherent risk process. They aren't part of the presentation. You may mention those. But first one we're going to talk about is the IRA Appendix C guide. It's a NERC template that we use. We've modified it somewhat and still continue to modify not only Appendix C but our entire process. Every time we go through an IRA, there's something different we need to look at, something we need to improve on. In fact, the one we're going to show you today, our Appendix C, we've already changed it. We made some modifications for that already. So we're looking at among our own group, we see we need to make modifications. We're taking input from compliance monitoring because they're on the receiving end on that too before it gets to you. They're seeing some things that maybe we should be looking at. So we're including everybody's input in the process about how to improve this IRA Appendix C, which we'll show shortly. And there's an entity profile package, which Tony and Jeff mentioned yesterday. There's two parts that we send out to the entity. One is the pre-audit survey. I think Tony mentioned yesterday it's the same survey you've seen for years. And the other one is the profile, which is based on information and data we already have and just sending it out to you to confirm it. It's valid and fill in the gaps that we may have identified. And then the third part is proposed IRA results report. We'll show you what the template is for that because we're not implementing it yet. We started to. We've got some changes. We had a discussion again this week of things we need to do with that between compliance monitoring and ourselves. So we'll show you what the NERC template is and what at some point should be getting to prior to your audit. And then we'll address any concerns or questions you have regarding any part of the process. Okay, this Appendix C, it is a NERC tool, and it's, when we bring it up here, I'll show you, it's brought into risk factors and sub-factors, and they're listed right there, and you'll see them on the Appendix C itself, so I won't go through every one of these here. Some of them, like, it's generic across all the ERO, and we recognize there's some areas that could be better regarding the risk factors and the sub-factors, and we'll still refine those. And then the criteria, I mean, that's pretty much the low, moderate, and high risk, and it's based on all that, the sub-factors and the factors there to come up with one of those three categories there. And the output is the risk level, and then what the recommended frequency and type of compliance monitoring tool would be, with its audit or self-cert or a spot check. I think one of the gentlemen in the audience yesterday mentioned concern about sharing the results of some entities' risk. Now, we were very serious about how we put together this Appendix C. We take all the data that we have and make sure it's as accurate as possible of entity's risk level. It isn't something done that we do in a couple hours. Like, an example, for a small entity, it may take, say, small LLC, DP, or small GOGP, it may take 8 hours to put together just an IRA just for that entity. I'm working on an entity right now. It's a larger entity. It's taken 2 weeks. It's a time-consuming process to collect the data, organize the data, analyze it, evaluate it, and then present that to compliance monitoring so they can look at and develop the final scope and any sampling that they need to do. So it's a long-taking process, and I told the entity yesterday I wanted this large IRA. I said, if that had been the first one I've done, I'd have quit. It's a lot of work. And that hasn't even gone through the whole process yet. It's still in my hands. I haven't handed it to Tony yet for compliance monitoring. So when I'm talking about the 8 hours to 2 weeks, that's just our part of it. That's not the other part that compliance monitoring and Tony or the managers have to do. There's a lot of time and effort put into developing somebody's risk assessment.
Yeah.
Now, even though you'll see in this example there, it'll calculate, it'll show you what the risk level is for this entity based on the data that we've validated.
You make it a PDF.
Our file's going to work here, but
it's a PowerPoint, isn't it?
It's really, there's been no surprises in this thing. I've had experience, worked with PJM, involved with PJM entities. I've got an understanding about what type of entities they are, and worked with MISA for some areas. And really, once I put all the data in, and it comes down to calculate the risk level, there's been no surprises. It has been something like, wow, I mean, I didn't expect them to be at this high risk goal or low. It's been pretty much what I already had in mind, because of the size of the entities, the history of compliance, where it should put them up. So it's pretty much lined up exactly what we expected. The only thing, we had one, was recently there was an entity who came up with a moderate risk. And that was the first one that we did not agree with. Even though Appendix C said it designated them as a moderate risk based on the criteria that we're going to show you, our recommendations were contrary to that. We believe that they should be treated as a low risk because of all the processes they had in place and the clean compliance history.
Get out of slideshow.
No, Appendix C said moderate, or we said low. Treat them as a low risk entity. So that's the only one so far that's contradicted what the Appendix C has calculated for a risk level.
Not in slideshow. Sorry, folks. The embedded Excel file is a hang right here. It's showing on this one here, but I can't display.
So, Don, I guess in that question for Don, in terms of you going to analyze it as a low. So then, are you saying that you then, when you had their audit, reflected a audit scope that was on a low range? Correct. Okay. Correct. Even though the sheet said moderate, based on the other information that's not part of the Appendix C, it's not part of the calculation. So there's a criteria that's not there that we considered, we factored into into it ourselves and say, you know, that this is a low risk. These guys have a good history over the last 6 years, even though based on that criteria that's in there, it popped out a moderate risk. We said, no, well, we don't agree with that. That was our recommendation to compliance monitoring. You know, so they'll be the ones that will develop the final scope. And to me, the ATL is the most important piece of our loop. It starts with John and I as the analyst. It goes through, as Tony described yesterday, it's the next step in the process. Then it goes to the ATL and then final approval by Gary. So, and then we get feedback from them regarding what they thought of our recommendations. If we were way out there and said, no, we don't agree, we added a lot more in the scope, or we took stuff out, you know, we changed it from an audit scope to a spot check or vice versa. So yeah, it's a long process. It's a very lot of checks and balances in the process. It doesn't go out and no one else really, you know, evaluates whether they agree with your findings or your recommendations or not. If you're able to make this larger, John?
I'd love to.
Me too, for my sake. I'm going to go from memory. So we've redacted some information on here that we use internally. So not all information it's on. Now the criteria, the sub-factors and factors are, and the criteria is what you'd see. Other than recent modification we made to get us a more accurate risk calculation, we found that there may be some deficiencies if something didn't apply to a particular entity. It's still factoring that in. So it was picked up by one of our compliance monitoring people. They said, you know, this is still factoring something in that doesn't apply. So we made a recent modification just last week to make sure it eliminates that part of it.
Don, I think we might be limited to that view, so if you could just speak to that.
Okay.
You want me to?
Yeah.
I can definitely take a second.
Apologize for that.
We can't read it.
I would have if I
Zooming
could.
on the bottom.
So,
No, literally on the Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, on the Excel spreadsheet, lower right-hand corner.
A little bar in the lower right-hand
corner.
So that's not visible on the screen on the laptop.
Sorry, I'm working backwards here.
Right there.
We're getting there.
There you go.
You want to go to the other side.
Yeah,
You want to make it smaller, not larger. It's not visible on the little screen there. That's the problem.
Okay.
So while we're taking care of the technical display issues right now, let me give you a little extra background in terms of how the IRA is implemented at RF. The IRA is the NERC ERO term standing for inherent risk. We use the inherent risk combined with two other risks when we produce our IRA report and the audit scope determination. Of course, the inherent risk is who you are, what your footprint size is, and any particular geographical issues that you'll see here. But in coming to our determination for what the audit scope or the monitoring activities that are going to take place, there's two other risks that are really important to factor in. And one of those is the execution risk of the organization. Now, that's not inherent risk. That is risk in terms of how you guys actually implement your programs. So the pieces that feed into that, if you will be your prior compliance history, your culture of compliance, those types of things that we factor into this that are not inherent risk. Okay? And then there's a third risk that we factor in when we come up with our determinations, and that is our monitoring risk, if you will, or audit risk. Well, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So if we have an audit process that says we're going to look at these standards and requirements, and if our process for auditing says, hey, when you're doing this and you find a violation, stop auditing, write the violation, and move on. We can introduce risk into that process if we stop and we leave latent issues in your organization that we don't uncover. We come back on a subsequent audit and then we find violations in that same requirement because we didn't uncover them during the first audit. Okay? And someone may draw the conclusion that, hey, they haven't improved or they've gotten worse because we found additional violations. No, they were always there. We just didn't uncover it. So that's the audit risk component, if you will. And then there's another risk to the audit component that has to do with whether or not we've looked at a particular requirement before or not at all. And so
So when we come up with the scope, we may balance some requirements that have never been audited before, just to close out the risk of not having looked at it before. So just because your audit scope changes a little bit, we're trying to get an appropriate baseline over several monitoring periods, if you will, to get a better, clearer picture of what your compliance performance is. Does that make sense to folks? Because I think if you just do the inherent risk alone, you don't cover all the aspects of what you need to cover, right? Now, the audit risk is something that RF kind of accepts in terms of what we're doing for making your status determination, compliance status determinations. So we want to manage that risk on our side. We want you to manage the execution risk that you have, and then the inherent risk is what you guys have to deal with in terms of operating in the system. And any questions on that? Are we back on?
Yeah, we are.
Maybe workable. I know it's not perfect, but it may be workable. I'll describe this. If you haven't looked at this, you can look at the guide. It does have what each category is. Other that's a generic one. That stuff, there's categories we made some modifications on to make it clear to help calculate, determine the risk. So we have done minor modifications to it. Now, the first area is registration. I mean, if you consider low your DP LLC, I mean, that's mostly common sense. If you're just all your LLC and DP, you know, it's going to be probably a low risk. Now, the high risk, there's only a couple entities that you're aware of. I mean, you're a TOP, BA, and RC. We all know who those are. There's only a few entities that are going to be in that high risk category to start just regarding a registration standpoint. Consider how much they impact what's going on the system. Other than some, you know, might say TOPs are part of that TOP part of it. So there's only certain entities that are going to be part on like the high risk area. Just like the GOPs, they're in the center. So whether you're a small GOP or large, you're based on a registration criteria, you're tagged as a moderate risk. And, you know, again, we're going to consider all these other factors. And like I brought up the other example, if it spits out a risk we don't agree with, we can justify it, we're going to change it. And like I said, recently we changed when we dropped it down to low risk because of other stuff going on, positive things we saw from this entity. The second area is system geography. And the first portion is, and John brought this up herself when Nurk and Ferk were here, we talked about these categories. System geography, it's not a big concern with us because you built your system in the particular area of your yard, and your system designed for your topology, whether it's mountainous, plains, or whatever. It's already inherent on your system, how it's designed and built for that. So that's not a real big concern of us in that area. You know, we tagged this for this example as a low risk. And now our sources, which you can't see over here, we won't be bothered to move that. I'll explain what's on this far right. If you're to the right of that risk entity level, there's a data source. We'll put, you know, we document everything we do. I mean, Jeff brought up yesterday with AML was easy. All you had to do is justify the NERC what you're going to add. We justify what we're adding and what we're not putting in. So we justify everything. Everything's justified. Whether it's in or out, where it came from. So we're putting what the data source is, and a lot of them, in the future, as Tony talked yesterday, the future, hopefully in that column, is going to be the entity profile. It's going to be something where we ask you to update based on 150 days out, update your profile. That's going to be our source. Right now, it's multiple sources, and we found that out a couple of years ago trying to develop your profile. We've got sources everywhere, internally. Sources, some of them we didn't even know existed. So each of our groups are asking for information for you guys, and we're finding out sometimes we're asking you for the same thing at different points. So we're trying to consider all that and put it in one place and just have you update it. So that's going to be their profile or data source in the future. But right now it's multiple sources, primarily internal sources. So we'll put our comments in there, what the entity's registered for. So this is specific to an entity, so we'll put exactly what they're registered for or what we're assessing for. Sometimes, as I think was talked about yesterday, we're not assessing the PSC function. So even though somebody may be registered with PSC, that's not going to show up in this profile because we're not assessing it for a PSC function. So we'll put that in there. That's from the compliance registry. That would be a data source, an example. The system geography would be like a public resource out in the internet or something, see what the topology is for that area where they're located in or areas that they're located in. The climate vegetation management, that's what our concern is there. It isn't the climate so much, it's how you're maintaining your vegetation management. Yeah. if you have no issues with that, it doesn't matter what your climate is. And the comment over here is what we put in. There are no vegetation management issues for the last 3 years, 2012, 13, and 14. So it's irrelevant where you're located at because you're managing that properly. So that's the key right there. This other area down here is the number of customers, net energy, load, critical customers. This information would be a source of a previous audit, your 300 survey, data smells for a previous audit. We'll be pulling that information there, so that would be a data source there. At this point, we put in how much load there was, and based on percentage of that region, whatever ISO or RTO in, that's your percentage of load, and this comes up to 1.5%, which puts you in the low category. It puts something in the low category based on that criteria percentage in there. The next area here is regarding transmission and generation. So if you're GOGOP and TOTOP, you're affected by these 3 categories right here: transmission, voltage, and also we're inserting miles in here. Even though there's not a category for that yet, and that was one of our improvements we talked about, inserting transmission miles, because that's more miles, higher risk possibly. But that's built into the comment over here. You got this entity has so much transmission miles at these voltage levels, and that puts them in a moderate category. And based on their generation capacity, it plugs them in there in that range, 1,000 to 10,000 megawatts in their loads. So we got all that data from you guys, from your previous audit or data for the entity profile questionnaire that we sent out and got back. Because we know there's going to be changes since the previous audit, whether it was 3 years ago, 6 years ago, things have changed. So, you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. I've heard you do some supplementation, modification for this spreadsheet. I guess my question would be then, is this same spreadsheet being standardized across the regions? So, or is it allow the current region to modify it as you see fit?
I asked that question at our IRA training last year. I was told by NERD, as long as we justify why we made changes in there for it, they don't have to be approved. At the time, I was told they don't have to be approved by NERD. But we will be able to justify why we made a change for it. And I think a lot of them we've done are positive changes, and the things we're talking about are positive changes. And we'll get down to one area where it's a region that didn't make that change. I'll give you an example. When we get to critical facilities, we put a medium range in there. If you've got no critical facilities, you're low risk. There was no criteria for the middle one, so you're either going to be low or you're going to be high. And we didn't really believe that was fair, representative of risk. So we made, if you were 1 to 6 or 5 or something critical facilities, you were a moderate risk, and you had above that, you were high. Well, one region, they made this statement at the IRA workshop: if you have 1 or more, you're high. There's no moderate. You're either low or you're high. We don't agree with that. So there's other regions, operating by the original template that NERC put out, and other ones have made modifications to it, and some have chosen not to put more of a granular scale in there to consider the moderate category. You're either black or white, and we don't totally agree with that. We feel there should be some moderation in there.
Thank you. Don, if you're a transmission-only company, you don't count the megawatts generation connected or the load of the entities, do you, or how do you treat that?
For like the peak load area down here, this would be a DP that we're getting that information from.
Okay, so the transmission-only company would only, you'd have not applicable on megawatt to peak load.
Correct, and that's what we found. I made a comment earlier. We made modifications to this because one of the compliance monitoring, one of the ETLs determined that it was still factoring in, even though we didn't have anything in there. It was still calculating the risk level with really basically NA. So we actually added a category NA. So NA it won't consider that.
So a couple other points on this. As you might imagine,
depending on what region you're in, we have a fairly high energy density region as opposed to some that might be rural. So the ranges for the 1,000 megawatts or 1 to 10,000 or above 10,000 might be adjusted or tweaked between the regions, right? So the objective for the top category that you saw, which was energy delivery, if you will, those two combined comprise 45% of your score. Those are really your inherent risks. And we're not trying to do a double counting of generation as well as transmission, but we're trying to use that as a very coarse, rough gauge for what size you are in the footprint of RF. Okay, so this is our first course through this. As we get more sophisticated with it, rather than putting into just those 3 discrete buckets, we'll probably develop a continuous range where we actually use the gas and TADS data to actually ratio you out in terms of where you fit within the footprint. But this is our course rating, and it seems to have worked out fairly well. We've benchmarked it against several different size organizations, and it's categorizing it into the appropriate buckets we have. We are trying to get a range of scores of 0 to 30 to be a low, 30 to 60 as a medium, and above 60 is a high. Okay, so whether you're 1 or 2% within there, it's not that digital, right? It's input into determining what type of frequency we're going to have with your organization from a monitoring engagement perspective. So the lows would probably push out, the moderates would probably stay at the base time frames for audit engagements, and the higher entities would possibly be subject to more frequent engagements. Not necessarily full scope audits, but more frequent engagements. So that's what this is intended to do holistically. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, thanks. And again, we're tweaking the values as we go along.
Keep going if you want.
Oh, okay. So without trying to kill you with looking at all the agonizing details of this list, if we can scroll down to the bottom, Christy. Keep going. I just want to get down to looking at the various different pieces. Hold there for a second. So we have a category in there for special protection systems under voltage as well as under frequency. And there's some debate within the region right now. Should that add risk or should it take risk away from an entity? If you have those special protection systems, you put those in there to protect your system so that it doesn't cause cascading outages. So there's a school of thought that says, hey, this should never add to your score. This should take away because you got these things. And then there's another aspect that says, well, they've got another aspect that could be misoperated or fail and cause some additional problems. But the reality is your total count of relay operations is only marginally impacted by this number. So we're looking to see whether that is an add or a negative factor from the total risk score, because you put those systems in there at expense to protect your system. So you shouldn't be penalized for it. But that's the discussions that are going on for this type of arrangement. And we're fine-tuning that. And Don and I are kind of in the camp that it shouldn't be a penalty. It should be a credit, actually. So if you want to scroll down some more. And again, we're taking into account that everyone's got a SCADA system or EMS, and it's just a 5% on the score. It's not really going to change the bucket that you're in. Then again, if you recall what I was saying, there's the inherent risk and then there's the execution risk. Now we're looking at some execution risk that you've had, whether you've had some violation history or whether you had some outages or misoperations. That's where it's factored in here. But again, these ranges are intentionally set to be small percentages to tweak. So if you're on the border of one or another, it gives us a little more insight in terms of where you're executing to your operation of the system. If you'll scroll down some more, please. And then if we can go over to this side here. So you can see that the rating levels are chosen, and if you can go to the right. I don't know if you can or not. Okay, so if you look at the scoring ranges, again, 30 to 60 is low, 0 to 30 is low, 30 to 60 is moderate, and then above 60 is high. And all of those ranges and all of the factors that we add up together are intended to course grade into low, moderate, or high. That's all it is. And based on that, you'll see potentially a push out of the schedule, keeping it at the base schedule, or maybe pulling it in a little bit more because your organization, based on your size, footprint, and execution may warrant a little additional oversight compared to the base frequencies. Any questions on that at all? Go ahead.
Has this appendix C criteria that you has been published? Or is that something that you guys internally are looking at?
Take an answer at that.
Again, this has been published in the IRA guide that we were talking about yesterday, so it's in the back of that as the actual Appendix C.
Okay.
So we've basically taken that, as Don alluded to, we've made some modifications to it where we felt changes were necessary, but it's pretty much, the information that you see here is on that plus some minor refinements. So it is out there. It's, like I mentioned yesterday, it was released back, I think, in the October time frame. It's out on the NERS site, so you can find that there too. Yeah. Scott?
First, I got one thing I like about RII last year when it started moving over, two-way conversation that we get to have with RII. The question I have is, if there's a factor that we think we might want to ask and consider, are we allowed to ask, hey, consider, and maybe beyond that, I don't know, but like, ask a factor for generation?
So excellent question. That's one of the criteria that we debated and we tried to get into this tool, if you will, at this point. I think it's an incredibly important consideration, right? So if you are running at 10,000 megawatts on your lines and your capacity is 10,500, clearly there's much higher risk than if you had 50% margin on that line or capacity. So that is something that we're looking at for future enhancements to this to make it actually a more meaningful tool, right? If you're always operating at your margin limits, certainly there's much higher risk in terms of contingency.
Let me add a little bit to that as well. You know, on that note, to your point, if there was something that you wanted to share with us, for example, when we send out your specific entity profile questionnaire, that could be the opportunity for you to capture something like that in one of your responses. You know, and that way when we get it back and we analyze that, we have that information from you. It can be considered as we're going through this or going through the IRA itself.
And our current entity profile survey that we do send out has been greatly enhanced from the previous pre-audit survey checklist, where we ask about all your system, what type of SCADA system you have, where your servers are, all that type of stuff. And we do ask the line loadings and stuff like that, transmission miles and all that. And that's where you can free-form text edit saying, hey, we think we managed our risk by putting in this additional capacity. And then clearly we'll look at all that information and incorporate that into the IRA. So, excellent question.
That would be down at the requirement level. Consider anything like that, overloads, how you're managing REST Ls or IRLs, that's going to be tied to the standard requirement level. Not this higher level, but it'll be down at that level.
Okay, thanks. I think we've hit this one pretty hard, so we'll get out of this Excel file. We'll go back to the presentation, maybe. It's not fun being at the display console there for doing this. Everybody's watching. No pressure, Christy.
There you go.
Okay, so as far as the pre-audit survey and entity profile questionnaire, what we've done for this year is we've kind of merged a couple of those things together. And for the SIP folks, as Tony and Jeff had mentioned yesterday, we'll send out the Excel file that is kind of the a la carte menu for choosing V3 versus V5 by requirement. We don't recommend that because it's allowed by the transition guide, but there are certain naturals that you break if you do piecemeal type activities. So if you do all of the subsequent standards for V5, but you hadn't done step 2, boy, you could be in a world of hurt for that. So if you look at it holistically, if you choose V3, we understand what the gaps are in terms of what those standards address. V5 has been built with certain gaps that we understand there. When you mix and match, there's additional potential risk that's created in terms of gaps that may or may not be covered because of only an 85% mapping between the two. So if that happens, we may have to look at additional scope to cover those gaps that we identify or see. Now this really is only an issue for entities that are under audit this year. Next year, it shouldn't be an issue because we'll all be on V5. But that's the spreadsheet that we send out. So that's an entity choice. Whatever the entities choose to do, we'll honor that request and perform the audit engagement appropriately. But we'll also send out the information really about 135 days. We try and get that out to you, maybe 120 days, so that you have an opportunity to see all the evidence that we've collected and filled out in this profile. Don and I like to call it our Easter egg hunt because we're just going all over the place trying to find bits and pieces of information. Whatever we do collect, we send you on is to have you verify, yes, that is true, or we've had an update to this or something, we'll bring that back in, and that absolutely gets factored into what your audit scope is recommended from our team to the monitoring group where we go through that formalized process that Tony spoke to yesterday. So these are the three particular things that we do, and we've incorporated other regions. I think to answer your question about are we similar to other regions, well, we're doing an IRA right now for an entity that we have 4 regions participating in. So I can tell you after this exercise here, our 4 regions will be pretty darn close. So that's half the arrow for how we're looking at stuff. And, you know, to be very candid, we stole one of the other regions' surveys that they use and plopped it right in the middle of ours. And the feedback we got from the entity that filled it out is it flowed very well. There was no suggestions they had for improvements, which I was kind of surprised about. But anytime we send you guys information like that, if there's any suggestions you have to make it easier or less painful or less cumbersome, we're all open to hearing that information. So please don't be shy about doing that. If you get a questionnaire from one of us, pick up the phone, call us if it doesn't make any sense, or hey, what are you really looking for? We'll be happy to answer that question. Next slide, please.
These 4 regions, can you speak to that? I guess that's because why did you guys choose this 4? And
it's a multi-region entity that this particular entity is registered with all 4 of us.
Okay.
So that's why. Right? And we're trying to go through the process to make sure it's a little less painful once you register to be a multi-region. We're the lead region for this entity, so we're guiding the other 3 regions through what we do for this thing, and we're learning and sharing, and it's actually a pretty healthy process. Okay, another Excel file.
Yeah, any profile questionnaire we've been sending out, I'm getting a response back exactly what I hoped for, and sometimes more. They're giving me validating everything I expected them to, and sometimes more information. So it's very, very helpful, helping us develop a very accurate profile and then arrive at a level of risk that's appropriate for the entity. That one entity, I notified them I was going to be sending a profile out, and they says, you know, that's not a problem because we're already doing our mock item now. We're prepared for any scope you hand to us. They're ready for anything. So they're very positive about that. And I had one that started out not so positive. And they said, well, I just provided your other team that was here for something else all this information. I sat with them for 3 days. I mean, what else would you possibly need from us? And I said, well, I'm going to take what you just did experience with them 2 weeks ago. That's going to be an input to this process, but I need you to validate what we believe we already have on you so we can develop a truly risk-based scope and possibly reduce your scope. So the whole attitude changed after that. So. Yeah, go ahead.
This one's yours. That's the SIP one.
that's version 3.
Okay, I'm sorry. So this one here, again, I don't know if you can shrink it down. This is the one that you will select whether you want B3 or B5 for any particular standard and requirement. When you get this, and again, it's only going to apply to a handful of entities, we will list every standard and requirement from SIP 2 through SIP 11, and then, of course, SIP 14. And then you have to go through and say, hey, we want to be audited potentially to this version of this requirement. So that can be a cumbersome activity. We will send this out and we will give you 15 business days to reply to this, right? So our hope is you're either going to choose B3 or B5 and not a mix and match because it's more difficult for your organization. And the guidance says, hey, if we look at B3 and it's not adequate, if we look at B5 and it's not adequate, we may have to look at B3. And you probably scratch your head saying, why would I want to sign up for 2 reviews during one audit, right? So it's going to be a lot more cumbersome, and if you had to prepare 2 binders for that, it might be very difficult. But again, that's a transition year, this year issue only. Next year it will all be V5. But that's what the file looks like, and it's not small to fill out. So the one that we sent out so far came back, just do V3. Great, thank you.
I have nothing to do with that.
Robert, is that included in the entity profile that you guys send us?
There are 3 files we actually send out, right? For SIP audits, we'll send out this, and then you get the entity profile and the other document, the other third document that we send. So you just get a package on our extranet that says, please fill out these 3 documents. And if it's for ops planning, you'll just get the 2 documents because you're not choosing for SIP P3 or P5.
Yeah. For the ones that y'all have done so far, has anyone appealed? Y'all have risk assigned level?
No, there's no appeal process for your risk, okay? What you'll do is you'll get notified of what your audit scope is, and in terms of sharing what the risk pieces are, we're still figuring out exactly what gets shared there, but it's not intended to have a discussion or a back and forth about what your risk ranking is. That really doesn't affect the standards and requirements you get. It has to do with the frequency of the engagements, okay? Go ahead.
I just want to know, the templates that you're showing us, are they available on your site? Instead of just receiving those when you're being audited in your package, are these available for review? So
I don't think we've published those on the site yet.
Let me add a little bit to that.
The compliance pre-audit survey, I don't believe that is on our site. I don't think we've ever had it on our site. We've always traditionally sent them with the audit package, but now we're pulling it up like I mentioned yesterday. The SIP RFI spreadsheet that John just spoke to, that I believe is actually posted on the NERC site, out there on their SIP transition specific site that they've established, so that's out there for everybody's view. And the entity profile questionnaire, which John's about to go into, that is not available because that's actually built as we're doing an IRA. It's entity specific at this point based on you and the information that we have, so that is not available. So,
I mean, would you consider just putting those templates out there for entities to understand? Just, even though it's not the final version?
Let me take that one.
It's something that...
So it'll be completely blank. The only thing of value coming back is, here's what we understand your system to be. You're either part of a JRO or you're not, right? So if we had a totally blank one, there you go. It's not going to help you in any regard at all. It's just some text boxes, and it'll say, hey, entity XXX and NCR number is this, and you've had this compliance history and it's totally blank. It's not very meaningful to you.
Don't have, it's not a template that has headings that an entity could look at and say, hey, these are the expectations.
Right, so if you go through this, we'll incorporate what we understand your compliance history to be. We'll put in what we know your generation to be from the last engagement that we had, and we'll look for you to validate. If we gave you the total blank one, I guess you could fill it out, and then we wouldn't do that stuff.
About filling it out or anything. I just thought the template would have standard headings of what the expectations are. When you get into an audit, what the expectations are at minimum. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, so if we scroll down to this, I think maybe you'll see what we're talking about.
All right, thank you.
John, you want?
So if we send you the template, this will be completely blank, right? All of the fields and all the text box and everything will be entirely blank. So, I mean, if that's valuable to you, I don't know why we wouldn't.
No, I thought it was more information.
No, if we create this individually each and every time for every entity on a per entity specific basis. So if we scroll down, you'll see that in this case here, we've created a fictional company, Midgen. It's not part of a CFR. It has critical assets and critical cyber assets. And then, we ask you to verify that that's true or not, right? So, we have a compliance history that tells us in the past you've had critical cyber assets, or if you're an entity that's had no critical cyber assets, it'll say that, then we really won't have much history on you at all because you didn't have any critical cyber assets. So if you look at these here, right, if I send you a blank, it's not going to say whether you have NIPRs or not, right? So we put in whether we know that you have it or not. We're trying to be a little more service-oriented so that you don't take something and have to create paragraphs and paragraphs on it. When we just say, yeah, you either have an NPIR or you don't. And then you confirm that and you can say, yeah, here it is, or whatever you want to do. Right? You got this. Yes, Jim?
Over the course of time, this is on paper right now. The idea is to move this from this kind of capturing ideas to more of an entity-focused, entity-facing database. So that I think Jeff or someone mentioned yesterday, maybe Tony, the idea is this is the way it's being done now. In the grand scheme of things, we want to move this to a database so that it's always current. Because now that you understand what this information is being used for, the whole intent is, at least on an annual basis, send out a little note, ask you guys for clarification, make sure it's current. So whenever we perform these things, all the information is there. So it's your data, it's not ours. You're just going to populate it and put it in there. This is the interim stuff until we get to the point where we have it on our database. Okay?
Thank you. I'll just make a comment. So I went through that Don did ours, our other things. Well, I was quite, I don't want to say amazed. I was happy that was what you had, you gave us the accuracy of it. They would be a lot of trouble. Okay? I can tell you put a lot of work into it because the data that was in there was quite accurate. I think we had maybe one or two that expired. So, to your point, Jim, I think, if there's some kind of periodicity where you would do it by us, go in and look to make sure it is accurate currently.
Once it's that way,
Yeah.
you know,
So then it's not overburdened for anyone. You can check it every, I don't know, year, quarter, whatever, make sure that we agree on what should be there.
exactly.
I think it would be really good, but it's quite thorough. And like I said, I was pleased going through it. I was like, one reminder to that.
We're talking about auditing or compliance monitoring process. Now, with this database that Jim talked about, this is something we hopefully do company-wide. So it'll benefit engineering, it'll benefit enforcement, it'll benefit everybody that's RSC. Because when we started this profile 2 years ago, again, like what I mentioned earlier, we found out there's information with all these other departments. We just didn't realize it was there. Now, they'd be asking for different intervals when we would need it. But this database is going to be for the use of hopefully the entire organization, not just for compliance monitoring or RAMs. And the other thing here is what we're trying to do in the profile, which you probably see that, you're not going to get these RSOs to fill out anymore for stuff that you don't even have. You haven't been issued a directive, you haven't maybe new connections with facilities, you haven't had difference derived limits, all that stuff you've had to fill out and send back saying it doesn't apply, no, I haven't experienced it. You don't have to see that anymore. So it's going to eliminate a lot of NAs on your results, on your audit results. It won't be shouldn't be NAs anymore. It should be a no fine. Well, it should be all hopefully no fine.
Right, so hopefully you can see that what we're trying to do here is service focused and not punish you guys to fill out stuff that's just a blank template. We do try and go through and fill out what's appropriate. We also, in the interim process going to this database, if you will, we're well aware about the sensitivity of the information here, especially on the SIP side, where right now we have to use the extranet to go back and forth. We have a secure connection for information, web CDMS ODI, that everyone has certificates for, so that we have some reasonable level of assurance for exchanging information. We just haven't settled on the right tool to use for that, so that you guys can go in and populate this stuff as appropriate. So, Peter, you have a question?
Yeah, I apologize, John. I'm confused on the timing of the assessment. Are you always doing that in front of an audit, or you got plans to do it
okay.
for all the entities that come through?
Great question. It's a great lead into what I was going to just talk to. So from the standpoint of how we do the IRAs and the ICE, you've all seen the flow diagram. It's more of a spoken wheel arrangement when we do the IRA. And if you look at the timing for how and why we do IRAs, we do it at about the 135-day point. And maybe you thought, well, why do you guys do it then? Well, if you look at organizational behavior, what we've observed, we know that every entity before an audit is scheduled for a year goes out and does some type of either internal or external review, and they do a mock audit, and then we get a flood of self-reports right before the 90-day notification. I mean, we've seen that regularly from all the entities. So we picked 135 days to allow that organizational behavior to give us that stuff to factor that in. Because we don't want to do this so far out in advance and then have a bunch of self-reports come in that now the audit team's got to deal with that, right? So we try and proactively deal with those anticipated type activities. And so we were having some discussions over the last 2 days about when the ICE happens. So whole compliance staff and your organization going through those reviews, right, Karen? You do all that activity. How can you fit in or squeeze in an ICE in between 135 days and 90 days when you have the audit team coming on? You have to ask yourself, do you really want RF personnel on your site 2 times in a 4 or 5 month period? Right? Then would we be able to digest and incorporate all that information in? So if you're looking for a timing perspective on an ICE, I think you want to do that at least 7-8 months in advance of when you're going to get audited so that you can have that information. You guys can get the report from the ICE, digest it back and forth between 2 organizations, then it gets input into this, and then we have something solid we can work with. And again, it's what your organization can digest in terms of your mock audits, your reviews by RF for an appraisal or an ICE or an assist visit or any of that type of stuff. All of those pieces of information get factored into our IRA to determine what your audit scope is. Right, so if there's adequate information in terms of what practice areas you've looked at that map to the requirements that we can take credit for, we do that. And Don's had some very good experience in terms of being able to reduce scope based on those activities. Right? Certainly a very high quality piece of evidence that we use in the previous audit. The auditors have always been coming up with a compliance culture for your organization. And, quite frankly, make sure if you do an appraisal or an ICE that you target it for the area that's going to be under audit. Because I think everyone understands you can have a siloed organization, as we spoke to yesterday, for ops planning separate from SIP. And those 2 organizations may have very different compliance culture performances. So if you just look at the corporate level, it may not translate to either one of these things that we can take credit for. So we urge you to, when you get that appraisal, have it targeted for the area that may come under your next audit, because that's where you're going to get the biggest bang. Everybody get that? Go ahead, Peter.
I need further clarification, because now I'm confused about the whole process, because it makes it sound like to me that the audits are driving the inherent risk assessment in ICE, whereas I thought the ICE should drive the audit.
You're a great straight man. So this year, when we kicked it off, we're doing the IRA assessments for these audits that are already scheduled for this year in the transitionary year. Perfect lead into exactly what we're going to be doing going forward. When we get over the next 2 years or so of stuff, and you can see how much work it takes to get one of these IRAs done, we want to do the IRAs in the right sequence for the highest priority entities that we have. So what we want to do long term is actually do the IRA, do the ICE in advance of this, and then we can actually resource staff the audit appropriately. You need 1 team of 3 guys or 2 teams based on the scope and size of the audit. So you're exactly where we're at in terms of how we're doing it right now.
Looking at this year, it's kind of a transition.
This is very much a transition year based on the audit schedule that's in place. We're working out the kinks, building our maturity level up in terms of how we do these things. And then hopefully as we get more automated with this process so that you guys can input the information directly to verify what we have, it won't take us the amount of time it's taking us right now to prepare these things. But we're trying to do high-quality jobs to make it easier on you so that you're not working with a blank slate of the art trying to go fill it out. So we're trying to provide a higher level of service, if you will.
One final question, does RF have some kind of timetable when they would expect to have all the IRAs done for the...
For all 380 entities?
Yeah.
Somewhere between 20 and 50. It's a lot of work. If you heard, the smallest entity IRA takes 8 hours right now, and the larger entities can take 2 weeks. Okay, and right now we've got both our team members on it, Don and I doing it. So if you do the math for that, then we don't take any vacations.
Or retire.
Let's keep it moving.
Yeah. Just real quick, like if you're at RCC, they got 50 to 60 entities, they can do all their entities in 1 year. And like John said, well, we think we have 355, it's still a lot, and it's not feasible to do them all. It's not feasible at all. So we're just taking them as the audit schedule shows up. Or we've had a couple outside the audit. There's other issues that somebody wanted to know what the entity's risk was. So there's 2 we've done outside the audit scope.
Yeah. Keep it going on the entity.
Yeah, and then one other piece, if you think about it, we try and leverage where possible the IRA that I'll do for SIP to leverage into ops planning and vice versa. If we're within 6 months, that information is pretty current and it's not stale. If it goes a year and a half, 2 years, it might be stale, or we have to refresh it and do it again.
few minutes.
Okay.
It sounds like, yeah, John gave you a pretty good idea what's part of the profile and why we need it for and how we're trying to, focus on your risk-based compliance monitoring process. And our ultimate goal has been to collect and validate the information so we can develop an accurate risk. And that's been our ultimate goal, but the way it's turned out, I mean, most of the audits have had a reduction in scope. And that's hasn't been our primary focus, but it just after the fact we look at what the final scope is and we look at what it was 3 years ago or 6 years, they're all reduced from what they were before. Now, what we're going to show you now is a template that NERC approved for the regions to use to drive consistency. Back in during our training last year, there was no plan in place. I think one region had, or two regions, it was us and one other region had a plan on how we were going to share results with the entities. Nothing was approved yet. They weren't sure how NERC wanted to approach that. Well, they did, I think, take the input of that training. They put together a template there. And we had something in place, so we sort of had to we're going to duplicate what we thought we were going to use, and pretty much resembles what the NERC template is. So there's no new work we have to do. We just have to replicate what we did prior to that and put it in here. So you could, there's two tables right here. One is going to be the risk, and that'll be reported. What we're planning on, this is tentative. This is not going to be for sure yet, because we're still talking about this, but there'll be two tables in here. One will be the table based on the Appendix C that we looked at earlier. It'll come up, it'll be the report from RAM of how we arrived at your risk level based on your profile. And the second table will be part of compliance monitoring table. This is what your compliance monitoring scope is going to be. So it's going to be two tables from each of our groups as part of the report that they're going to be shared with you. I think Tony mentioned maybe 110 days out, something like that. But that's all in the worksheet. We're still trying to refine what we want to put in there, who's going to be the sharing, how long out it's going to be before the 90 days. But again, I think somebody had a concern yesterday. They asked the question, well, how am I know what my scope's going to be? And again, what's been turned out so far, if you're prepared for the old AML, you should be easily prepared for more than likely probably a reduction in scope, more focused on your risk and not just something global that's trying to catch. It's supposed to be a catch-all.
Yeah, actually, let me add a little bit to that. Go ahead, Bruce. You got a question?
Yeah. So this is an internal document?
No, this is going to be, when we conduct our internal IRA and complete it and put it through the whole approval process that I described yesterday, this is a separate document that will be created, and it'll contain the information that you see on the screen. So our internal report will feed the content for this. So,
but this isn't approved yet of what we're going to distribute to the entities, correct?
No, this has been approved by the ERO, by NERC. The ECMG, for those people who know what that is, they basically approved that a few weeks back, and we just got this. So we're in the process of integrating this template into our IRA process. But this is the approved template. This is what NERC has asked all the regions to use. This is what's been shared for consistency's sake. So, Christy, if you could scroll up to the top a little bit. There's some general language that explains it up in Section 1. Go down a little bit. And the purpose, that's going to explain to you the purpose of the IRA and the document itself. Section 2, that'll be completed by the RAM team. That'll be kind of specific to the entity that the IRA is applicable to. And then the IRA results summary, Section 3, is what the RAM team, either Don or John, will populate. And that, like Don said, will be the Appendix C, what we showed you. That'll be an excerpt. And if you look at that table, it's looking for the risk factors, the sub-factors. Well, Christy, if you could scroll down, it's just in the next two tables, please. We'll list the risk factors, the sub-factors, what the ranking, what the ranking was, high, medium, or low, and then any justification or how we arrived at our determination there. And then Section 4 will be completed by the compliance monitoring team. And what you'll find in there is not just audit-related requirements. Right now, our discussions are that that'll be really your oversight plan, your compliance oversight plan, covering audits, spot checks, or self-certs. Because that's what we're ultimately trying to develop here. So that's what you can expect to see in this public-facing report. Like I said yesterday, we're working through the kinks, getting it integrated. This quarter, we plan on starting to send those out for any upcoming IRAs. We're not retroactively going back and completing these for IRAs that have been done 3 months ago or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of where we're at with that. Yes.
So although they're labeled confidential, non-public, and they got the legal entities heading on it, how are you going to safeguard this information? Because if I compare, let's say, 4 TO companies who want to build transmission in the U.S., and one region, or even if they're all within RFC, one is ranked as the 60s and one is ranked as a 40. How, if that gets out in the public world, it could affect bonding, insurance, everything else regarding that company. So how is this all going to be protected?
So here's what we're planning on doing, okay? When we share any of these results here, we're going to share it via secure means. And when I say secure means, it's going to be on the extranet with you guys. We're not planning on publicly releasing this. We're going to share with you, just like we share audit results for SIP audits, which are confidential and restricted information, okay? So we're going to share it with the entity.
Only.
Only. So it's not...
I realize that's the intent, because it's almost like setting up a FICO score on utility.
You're not going to get a score. We're not going to share the score numbers that we come up with. You're going to get a low, medium, or high that adjusts your frequency. That's what you're going to get.
But what it does, if this gets out in the public, it says this is company X's risk of reliability, and people will take that, whether it's for bond issues, or insurance rate, company A is a little bit more risky than company B.
Well, so right now, the violation history of the entities is out there. On the SIP side, most of that information is redacted.
And they deserve the violation history, but this is just, you're mountainous, you're attached to the Great Lakes, or, you're attached to Mexico, whatever,
Here, Jen, give me a mic.
This seems to be a little risky.
Well, the process, I understand your concern, and I mean, we'll take it back, definitely consider what you're saying. But in this document, first of all, I can't stress enough, we will only share it with the entity. Beyond that, it's unfortunately out of our control. We'll share it securely. The other thing, the risk table that you see will clearly show what risks have been identified and ranked in order for us to land on a final risk ranking. So anybody who would potentially get this report outside in the public will see what that risk is based on. To your point, it's not financial related, it's not real estate related. I understand your concern. I'm not trying to minimize it by no means, but they'll clearly see what that risk ranking was based on and why it was used and what we used it for, ultimately to determine your compliance oversight plan. But we'll take your feedback back and consider it and see if there's anything we need to change in the process. Just to be frank, I mean, this is something that the ERO has developed, the IRA process, I'll say, and this is one of the byproducts of it. We wanted to increase the collaboration and sharing with the entities because the feedback that we receive from you as the entities is we like to be engaged and transparent. I don't think so. This is one step in that direction. So that's what we got. But appreciate the feedback, though. Very good comment.
We got it.
Okay. And the next slide. Okay, so in summary, you're going to see the Appendix C, the entity profile package. You will have seen that because you completed it. And then the IRA results report. What we'll say is, I don't want to use the term publication, but the entity shared result is what you'll see out of the outcome of this. And again, that affects the frequency of the engagements. I think, you come to the same conclusion if your total generation is 200 megawatts, you're probably going to be in the low bucket. If you've got 20,000 megawatts of generation, you're probably going to be in the larger high-risk bucket. Right? And the moderate will be in between there. Right? So I'm using very coarse numbers to get to the other end of the spectrum. None of these things should be really a surprise to an organization. What does change on an entity basis is your performance next line.
That's it.
Okay, any questions? Any thoughts? Yes, sir.
Just an additional clarification on the timing. You had mentioned 7 to 8 months now to work on an ICE, which I really like that advice. But what I'd like to have would be my IRA before I start working on it.
That's out of sequence. We don't start the IRA process at the present time until 135 days. And again, we're in the transitionary period. Okay? So from the standpoint of the IRA, you're going to ask me to tell you what the scope is. Right? If I tell you what the scope is, why would you go through an ICE that will then cut down that scope? I would want to do the ICE first and get the scope cut down first, and then have that factor into the IRA so that we can use that information and reduce your scope appropriately, or customize your scope appropriately. Does that make sense, or?
How about the intent of the ICE was to further reduce the scope based on the IRA?
Right, so the IRA will take into account the ICE results. Okay, I can't take it into account if I don't have that information. Am I losing people?
Now let me add a little bit to it.
Just based on your own flow chart, the tattoo chart.
It's a spoke and a hub.
We got the comment yesterday on this, and we're bringing it up again and again. We'll take this back and kind of evaluate it, because I don't know how many of you are attending the ICE breakout session, but we're still working. The ICE isn't as far along in implementation here, reliability first, as it is, and the IRA is. So we're definitely following the timeline that John and Don spoke to today, and what we mentioned yesterday. That's not to say that we can't potentially change it. Like I mentioned yesterday, I mean, if we realize that entities do want ICEs done after, we might fold that into the process. So, I mean, there's still work to be developed there.
Just so you know, I mean, several small entities went down to Atlanta and we went through an ICE exercise just to exchange information, collaboration. One major outcome we brought back to us was it really didn't make sense to work on your ICE until you knew what your priorities.
Okay.
So, for a small entity.
All right, I appreciate that feedback. And like I said, we're still working through it. I mean, Jeff Crago and Eric Johnson, Eric's team manages the ICE evaluations, and we're working very closely with them, and we'll continue to monitor the timeline and the process itself and all that. So we'll take this information back as we further refine it.
All the reasons to wrap that exercise, by the way, RF didn't make it.
Okay. So in terms of doing an ICE, the ICE, you want to craft the ICE for the areas that you're looked at appropriately to get the biggest bang for your buck in a reduction. Okay? Our IRA process at RF is set up to take into account all the information streams we can to customize the focus of the audit. So the ICE really has to happen in advance of the IRA. Because like we come up with an IRA and here's your audit scope, and then you go out and get an ICE and say, well, we think we should cut this back some more.
You're still confusing me, though, because the ICE is voluntary.
Correct. We take any source of information we can to appropriately scope an audit or a monitoring activity for you. Right? So if you want to engage with the ICE process, where you get your controls evaluated, we'll factor that in to the upcoming audit scope. Now, if you're doing all of this stuff off of an audit cycle, let's say you're a 6-year entity on a baseline thing, and you do it 3 years out, okay? The ICE will take place for that activity, for your entity, and that'll be factored into the next time we do an IRA. But in terms of whatever you have evaluated, there is a mapping of those practice areas to the particular requirements that are in effect. But if you're looking at V5 type considerations or any other standards that are changing, certainly you want to have that evaluation take place when there is some validity to the requirements that would be affected. So, Tim?
I do have a question. I think part of the confusion is you're talking about the entity risk assessment. So the entire review of the entity, their controls, their inherent characteristics, their strengths, their weaknesses, their designs, or oversight. What this gentleman is talking about is the inherent risk assessment. These are the things you can sort of Google and find out about a company. And I do think that there's value in doing that part first, because it's sort of the beginning of the funnel. So I'm not sure if maybe it's terminology that we're tripping over here, but it sounds like we're confusing inherent risk assessment with the overall entity risk assessment.
Right. So if you capture what I said at the beginning, our process used to be called the Entity Risk Assessment. To be consistent with NERC, we've now called it the IRA. Our Entity Risk Assessment that we branded as IRA here takes into account the three risks that we talked about at the beginning of the session. One is the inherent risk that an entity has. The other is the execution risk that the entity has. And the third piece is the audit, oversight, monitoring risk. Right? So when we do our activity that we're branding as IRA here, it's all three of those. So from an inherent risk perspective, I understand what you're saying, but we're calling it one and the same. So that could very much be a source of confusion.
We'll
Yes.
take it back.
I guess just to add on to Bob's comment, you know, we can sit down as an entity and look internally at what we believe our risks are. We can note that. RF can come in, look at and do an inherent risk assessment. It may be on the same page. It may be a 180 out. So that's where we kind of need to know if RF is looking someplace else, and that's where we want to choose to put our resources at to help with that risk. And I think that's what we're kind of want to make sure we're on the same page. Got to be a value added. Up again, and then look at the opportunity further to create value for this potential. Resource allocation, preparation. I'm just saying that's a value added from the entity perspective to have that information.
Let me bring this back. Scott, to your point, one of the objectives of this breakout was to show you what factors we're looking at when we're evaluating your inherent risk, and that's available to you right now. You can look at the IRA guide. You can look at this presentation now because you'll have that information available. So that will clearly show you what factors we're evaluating to determine your inherent risk. As we run that tool, we do that tool based on the information that we get from you. And in your profile, if there's information or risk factors that you believe we should consider, that again is a place for you to include that so that we have your input as we're considering and developing the IRA. So I think that's one way, and that's not to say, I mean, we collaborate with the entity. We push a lot of this information through the secure extranet via email. We've done calls with entities where clarification has been needed, and that's the type of collaboration that we try to instill throughout the entire process. So if there's something that you want us to be aware of when we're doing your IRA, please don't hesitate to call if it's not already captured in the questionnaire or in your response to the questionnaire or something like that. So we'll definitely consider that. Just one quick time check. I'm getting no, we got to call it, I guess, based on our timing here. It's 9:15. One more question, and then we're going to have to call it a meeting. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question to clarify. A moment ago, you were saying that only in transition year that you try to do the IRR in conjunction with the audit scale. But my thinking is in the ever-changing world, the entity characteristic and risk changing. So it's probably beneficial to try those two together instead of moving ahead and get these IRRs, locked and laid out and then have to redo it again or update or revise when it comes to audit time.
That's a great point. And like I said, with IRA just being rolled out, our first boundary, I guess I'll call it, is, we want to use the audit schedule as a guide for which IRAs we're going to do first. As we work through all 300 plus entities, we're going to continue following that during this next couple of years. This is a transitional year. We're going to do those that are on the audit schedule, but as Don mentioned, we've done a couple IRAs for entities that aren't on the audit schedule. As I mentioned yesterday, if there's some kind of risks that we learn of through our regional risk assessment or some other means, that might drive the need for us to do an IRA for that particular entity. So we're going to, again, as we're implementing this whole process throughout our region, that's the cycle we're going to follow, and then eventually, to John's point, we're going to get through all the IRAs of an entity, but then each IRA will need to be refreshed at a periodic point. And that goes back to the profile that Don was talking about, or Jim. If we get an electronic profile that's refreshed by you annually, you might be up for an IRA refresh as well based on what's going on. So we're still working through the sequencing and the timing of all this, but we've thought of the points you're making, and you're also making some very good points for us to take back and consider some more. As well as the timing for the ICE and the IRA, we know what the TAP 2 diagram shows. We're trying to follow that. We're still developing and molding our ICE process. So we'll take all this feedback back and see where we might need to adjust our timelines or integrate these differently. So just want to say I appreciate all the feedback, and we'll definitely take it all back. Thank you very much for your attendance and your time. Appreciate it. John, Down, thank you for the presentation.
For us to have separate files opened up.
That's what I was going to make sure. Well, we have